let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the podcast where we talk about gaining, fetishism, and everything in their orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. Today we're welcoming to the show for the first time. Today we've got Jean.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Hello, my darling. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, wonderful. We're so glad to have you here today. We're going to be talking something a little bit different today. We're talking the non-binary experience within the gaining and fetus communities. So, as always, because of course these types of conversations, we're talking about a spectrum of experiences and identities here. As always, folks, Jean is going to be expressing their perspectives, their experiences. If you are non-binary, they may be different to yours. If you feel that your perspectives and values are not represented, do not message Jean about it. Instead, reach out to us. We'll have a non-binary gaining part dos, and we can have you on to express your particulars on the matter. But we're all here today to have a good old bloody time and chit-chat some bullshit regaining. So, darling, are you ready to get into it?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Ah, wonderful. So, kicking things off, for anyone listening who, and let's be frank here, like the whole non-binary thing, it's been around for a minute. But there are plenty of people who still are learning, people who maybe aren't fully familiar with it, people who don't know what the fuck it's about. So just as a bit of a tepid little intro here, how does non-binary manifest to you? What is the definition you go with? And for our own knowledge, would you please express like how you find yourself fitting into the non-binary space? Any labels you might use, any descriptions that might help our listeners who might not have the depth of understanding?
Sure. Well, I identify as trans non-binary. And basically non-binary for most folks is just a way of saying that you do not identify yourself as a male, you don't identify yourself as a female, regardless of what equipment you were given at birth, whether that be by nature, God, or medical science. For me, I like the trans non-binary label because I had someone at I can't even remember when, several years ago, I saw a video, a reel, or a TikTok or whatever, where someone referenced that they, one, identified with the experience of the trans community, even though they were not medically transitioning, and two, because they felt that they were transitioning away from the gender they were assigned at birth, whether that's to, a full presentation of the opposite gender they were assigned at birth, or neither, or whatever that might be. So that resonated quite a bit with me.
And I really appreciate you sharing that, because for me, and for anyone who does not know, I suppose this is a moment for me to share it officially. I am also non-binary. Right? I use the term demi-guy when describing my gender. And Jean, you and I had a bit of a conversation about this briefly. I struggle a little bit sometimes because in my mind, I picture gender a little bit, this might sound stupid, a little bit like an orange, in the sense that you've got the big old amorphous, fleshy, fruity bit, and just at either opposite end, you've got the two navels. And in my mind, one is male, one is female, and then the full up, down, forward, and every three-dimensional spectrum of the fruit in between is something non-binary, right? And so for me, I picture myself, I don't know how far away from the male I am, but it's certainly within like waving distance. I'm sort of still nearby to it. But, there's a part of me that feels a little bit like, oh, I see this for myself. I know this of myself. And yet I haven't made any amendments to my presentation necessarily. I haven't really made any amendments to my lifestyle, to my clothing. For the most part, it comes down to my pronouns, which are he, they, and just knowing in my brain that I'm not quite male. So, I appreciate being able to hear a little bit of how you see yourself in that trans non-binary space and what that means for you. Tim, bring you in here as, old guard Leatherman. You've expressed on the before that in your queer dalliances that there are conversations that maybe you're not necessarily a part of, but you do observe where there's some misunderstandings or some bits around the
Yeah.
concept of gender. And
Well,
I
there
just
was just a time when people weren't talking about it. There was a time when I was 18 and I was going out to the gay clubs and bars, there were only four letters in the acronym, and there wasn't a lot of mingling that went on. Like there were gay bars, there were lesbian bars, and then mixed into both, you would have people who were trans and people who were bisexual. But it's not like these groups did a lot of talking to each other. It's like the young gay men always ran together in a pack because they always do. And then the older gay men would sometimes sort of group together, and then you'd have like just miscellaneous people wafting in and out. But like it wasn't as if we were all having conversations with each other. So there are just a lot of things that I wasn't made aware of because I was kind of living in an echo chamber. I was just surrounded by gay men of a certain age, and we just did our thing. So the first couple of times that I was introduced to people who were trans and non-binary wasn't even being brought up at the time. But it was like I couldn't quite identify with what their life experiences were. So it just didn't lead to a lot of conversation. Then I actually became friends with some trans people, like really got to know them. And I was, sometimes it takes that level of exposure. In terms of like the people that I know in my current social circle, I don't know any that live like near me that identify as non-binary. That still seems to be kind of a thing that isn't coming up that often, at least not in Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, I think part of that is that it is definitely an emerging identity. The gender spectrum, as we are kind of starting to understand it, really only became known, even though people beyond the gender binary have existed for, we have, archaeological and anthropological evidence going back as far as the Iron and Bronze Age, that there were people who like, oh, this person isn't strictly speaking a man or strictly speaking a woman. That goes back that far. The idea of a gender spectrum as we understand it now really didn't get introduced until the 1960s. If that's something that people are interested in, there's an anthropologist named John Mooney, or Money, I believe. Really, really interesting writing if you're interested in the topic of gender. Fair warning, he's a little dry. It is very academic text. But you can kind of see, even in the 60s, he starts to present the idea of, even just in the idea of presentation, and there are things that we look at now and we would kind of go, oh, that person maybe trans or maybe non-binary, that, watch any episode of a television program from the 80s and look at the women's fashion. These are things that, without realizing it, we have always grown up around. There's always been something that defied the traditional gender stereotype. And in a lot of cases, we haven't really thought that much about it. Folks my age and younger are very much the MTV generation. We have always seen men in makeup, men with brightly colored hair, men wearing skirts or full dresses or whatever the case happens to be. And this was all long before even the internet, which I think has blown the entire conversation wide open.
Yeah, when I think back to being young in the 90s, there was this weird conversation around tomboys, right? Like the idea of a girl who climbs trees, like, oh, she's a tomboy, she likes to play with the boys. And I don't know why having this weird feeling about tomboys, but then that must have come from my family because it's like, well, prejudice is not innate, it doesn't get born out of nothing, it comes from somewhere. So it's interesting, right? And even the little things these days, like, a gender reveal party. But then even before the craze of gender reveal parties, reflecting on, you remember that period? Like, I was still a child in the 90s. Like, I've seen the photos of, like, when I got christened and my mum put me in, like, a fucking baby's bridal gown that they...
Oh, the christening gown.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? They put me in
Yeah.
drags at 6 weeks old. Dunked me.
Yeah, that is. I remember. I think I asked my mother about that once because she's still a Catholic, and I don't remember what her answer was. But I think I asked her like, why is it always like a dress? And she's like, well, you're an infant. Does it matter? She's like, it could have been a onesie, but it was just tradition to put you in a christening gown. She didn't know where that tradition started. She just knew that she had been upholding it.
But again, your mother coming from a certain generation, even in that flippant moment, you're a baby. What does it matter? Exactly, fucker. What does it goddamn matter? My God.
I was going to say, obviously I have a little bit of a different perspective on gender in general from, I think, most people. One, gender reveal parties freak me. They're weird. You're telling the entire world your baby's genitals.
Yeah.
That is so strange to me. Like, I don't
Well,
need
it was
to know
probably started just so that people would know what type of clothes to buy, honestly.
Sure. But even that is a very modern invention, because remember that up through the Victorian and Edwardian periods, those color palettes were reversed. Boys wore pink.
Yeah, because it was
in those days.
red, the color of blood, and women were
Right.
because it's the color of the sky, and they're so gentle like the summer sky, or whatever the bullshit was,
Right. And I mean, honestly, that is. I will be honest. I joke. I'm a pink girly. I mean, you can see what I'm. The listeners can't see, but I mean, I'm wearing a pink shirt. I have pink earrings. Up until pretty recently, I had pink eyeglass frames, which I took no end of grief from men over, which was hilarious to me. But yeah, that's just a matter of it's my favorite color. It also seems to piss off people who have a toxic masculinity problem, so that's just a bonus.
But then I don't understand that slight craze in the early 2000s where men wanted to all wear pink again, because suddenly like men were rocking the pink polos and pink button downs, and
men were wearing salmon pink, and it was specifically salmon pink because that was a man's pink. You were allowed to wear salmon pink because salmon is a fish, and you were allowed to go fishing because fishing is masculine. So you're allowed to wear salmon pink.
Oh, that is so stupid.
Well, fashion is very cyclical in nature anyway. I mean, being a little bit older than you guys, I could say, I mean, a similar moment came up in the 80s where, at the height of like Miami Vice fashion, everyone, men wanted to wear white linen and bright colors. And,
and perm their hair and everything. Like they all wanted to.
8 or 10 years later, when Seattle grunge became the dominant aesthetic for a while, then everybody wanted to wear these dark flannels and dark jeans and dark. Okay, and then like you said, you gave it a minute, and we were back around to like everyone needs to wear bright colors now. That's what's it.
So talking a little bit more about your non-binary identity, I'd like to know from you, like, what has your journey been like in coming to learn about and understand your sense of being non-binary? And I'd like to understand as well a little bit of that journey with gaining.
Sure. It's kind of hard to pinpoint because I am definitely, again, I identify very much as part of the trans community. And I think that I have a very similar story in that regard to a lot of trans folks. Like, when I think back to, my very, very early childhood, I was a child of the, let's say, late 70s. And, so growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, I didn't want to play with, I didn't want G.I. Joe. I wanted Barbie. I didn't, and I mean, obviously these things are very superficial, but, just when I think back to, the play patterns, when I watched Scooby-Doo, I didn't want to be Fred or Shaggy. I wanted to be Daphne, and these kind of things. And then as I got a little bit older and entered into puberty and started to kind of have an understanding that like trans folks were a thing that existed, because, in my day, there was no representation. The closest thing we had was Michael Caine in Dressed to Kill, which is not a great portrayal of a trans person. Fabulous movie, not a great portrayal of a trans person. Or then we got to the early 90s and we had Silence of the Lambs, and it was like, oh, that's gonna do great things for the community. Excellent, okay. But going through puberty, I sort of kind of realized like, well, I don't particularly desire to medically transition. Honestly, being a woman is a lot of work, y'all. I don't know if you knew that, but it's a lot of work. And so I knew that wasn't particularly for me, but at the same time, I have never identified with anything that was considered masculine. And of course, we know that these, all of the things that are considered masculine, I mean, it's all societal constructs, right? None of those things are, going camping, going fishing, liking football, none of these things are really inherently relevant to what genitals you have. But that is the way we are socialized in our society. And all of those things just never interested me. I was never interested in sports. My parents absolutely had to force me kicking and screaming to go to Cub Scouts when I was a child. And the moment I was old enough to actually forcefully say, I don't want to do this, then, I was out. But, I was always more content to sit in my room with a book. And, I was a very studious child, so I did a lot of reading, and inevitably I found in fiction that, these male characters didn't identify with me. I never wanted to be Han Solo. I wanted to be Princess Leia. But at the same time, understanding like, okay, I'm definitely not a woman. But I kind of was like, okay, well, I'm something in between.
I like that. I think for me, my own non-binary journey really comes from a lot of challenges put forward to men, and a lot of people sort of talking about how ultimately, well, the reason why men struggle is because men are like this. And I just sort of look at those arguments and be like, well, it's not me. It's not how I think. It's not how I do what I do. Like, my sense of maleness has never been in conjunction with anything like that. And even the ways in which I still feel an alignment to maleness, I don't feel like that is challenged by a lot of those tropes. So I think that was a point for me where I was like, well, maybe this means something a little bit more than just X, Y, Z. And the reason why I want to bring up gaining and all this, obviously gaining podcast is the relation to gaining. The reason why I think it's really important is because I think, for me, I've always referenced the fact that my mental health journey has been the biggest influence on my weight gain and my ability to gain weight most easily. Part of that has been mental health in terms of, loving on myself, being kind to myself, dealing with trauma, but also gender. And while I didn't feel such a strenuous sense of, in owning my sense of transness, my sense of non-binariness, there's still a sense to which I look at it and think, I do believe this has been a big influence on me and my life. Tim, to bring you into the conversation here, like, when you think about your gaining and your sense of maleness, do you feel like they inform one another, or that maybe one is rooted in the other for you?
Possibly. I definitely do feel more masculine since the weight gain, because when I was skinny, I I wouldn't say that I was like very effeminate, but like there was a litheness to my body that kind of could make it more androgynous, right? And there were certain planes of my face that were a little softer for, like being thin. And I thought that made me look kind of androgynous as well. And I didn't really like that too much. I mean, I pretty solidly identify as a man. And I like looking masculine. I like feeling masculine. And when the weight gain started, that's when I really began to feel masculine, because like, well, now I look like a guy. Now I look like like a dude, like just an average dude. Like, this is what I, went for. And like, there are times when I kind of miss how I could play with androgyny when I was thinner. But, honestly, it was wasted on me anyway, because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't really take advantage of it at the time. So.
Right. Well, I think there's something of a stereotype there at work too, and I don't think that's necessarily positive or negative, but in a lot of cases, and it's become kind of a meme. You see it all the time that people post, non-binary people don't owe you androgyny. And certainly there are plenty of non-binary folks, whether they be assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, who absolutely present androgynously, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, not all of us do. I have lots of friends who identify as bears or as chubs who are non-binary, and I'm fully aware of what I look like. I have facial hair, I have a deep voice. I'm aware that I'm very unlikely, regardless. I could wear a ball gown down the street and no one is going to say that is a woman. And thankfully we do have, I think, more representation of that now. Thanks to folks like, frankly, Jeffrey Marsh. Jonathan Van Ness is a great example. Sure. I mean, he has beautiful long hair. He has a beautiful beard. For a long time, he had that gorgeous handlebar mustache. But at the same time, he showed up at the Golden Globe Awards last night in a beautiful floor-length ball gown.
Alok Menon is someone who comes to mind for me, and when I think about, narratives being spoken about, just one of those voices who I think is so core to the narrative, I know we kind of look towards like who are the icons of our generation, who are the people who speak, and I do think that Alok is going to be one of those people remembered in history as a non-binary voice, especially as a person of color and a person of, such a specific background with such specific experiences, like their poetry and just their joy in how they speak, to me is one of the biggest game changers. Like it often feels like in queerness and even within gaining, within fat positivity and everything, there feels like this need to fight, which let's not be beat around the bush here. Oftentimes there is because people be out here saying bullshit. But Alok, yes, while they can have those moments of impassionment, they in so many ways speak beauty and light, and they talk about joy and owning who you are in just such a way that I'm like, y'all can't fucking take this shit. Like, if you listen to this for more than 2 seconds, it would break your little brain because you would have to reckon with everything you ever built up that was just like not okay. But anyways, for anyone who's never listened, Alok Menon, go check him out.
I was going to actually add that as we kind of discuss that more. If anyone is remotely curious, whether you feel like, you might not identify as a fully binary male or female or not, if you just want some insight, Alok's book, Beyond the Gender Binary, it's a very quick read. It's not a long book. They actually sold it a couple of years ago at Target during their Pride collection, which I was very impressed by, back when Target still did a proper Pride collection. It is a great book. It's going to run you like less than $10. And his or their, I apologize, I don't know Alok's pronouns, but their perspective is just beautiful. It's as you said, it's a lot about joy, and it's a lot about queer joy too, which is, I think, a lot of times a very separate and overlooked thing.
Tim, we've had this conversation before. You've tried to introduce me to several queer things that I've ultimately just had to poo-poo and say, I can't deal with this because everyone's a cunt and I'm not in the mood. Like, oh, are they dying of AIDS? Oh, is he a whore? Oh, is there cheating involved? It's almost like, oh, wow. What an incredible reflection of my...
Once upon a time, we didn't have that many options, okay? There were maybe like 5 or 6 films that we could cycle through.
I know, but what I'm saying is, this is where I'm at in my personal journey. I'm looking for queer joy, right? And this is why I think moments like this, I'm like, let's bring that up. Because sometimes people are gagged where they're just like, I didn't know that we could have this.
There's a story that floated around Tumblr and a few other places when the first season of Heartstopper was released. Speaking of shows about queer joy. And frankly, some great representation of folks who are not strictly male or female. Yasmin Finney's amazing on that show. I think she's wonderful. She's a beautiful trans actress. A lot of folks recently just saw her in Doctor Who playing Donna Noble's daughter, so that she's great in that. But there's a story that floats around about a group of kind of what you would call lads at a bookstore, and they were looking at the display of the Heartstopper comic by Alice Oseman, which is, I love the book, I love the show, I think both are just spectacular. But one of the guys kind of warned his friend off it by saying, like, oh, it's a gay book. And the bookseller kind of rankled and was sort of like ready to leap in and defend this book that she loved. And then one of the other friends goes, no, it's okay. None of them are sick or dying. And then the kid bought all 4 volumes of it. And that was, her initial reaction was, oh, he wasn't upset that it would be a gay book because of the themes. He was upset that he didn't want to read another bury your gays trope.
Yeah.
He was actively seeking queer joy. And that book certainly provides it. And those characters are not without their problems or with their foibles, because that's what makes a good story. But, and they've invented a new character for the show, and that who is Ace, who is just a delight. I can't recall the actor's name, but I think he's great. So, we're getting some really good representation out of that show. And it's kind of one of those moments where, the kids are okay. They're going to be all right.
Yeah, Tide Pods was a worry, but you know what? You come around okay in the end.
Well, here's something that I would just like to know, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with the topic. This is mostly just on the grounds of entertainment. It's like, okay, so we don't want the bury your gays trope, but then why does everything else have to be some meretricious saccharine garbage that, like, has like nothing to like. I was just so like I had been watching reviews of Red, White, and Royal Blue, and I'm like, okay, I have to see this idiocy for myself. And I did, and it is saccharine garbage, but it's like, why is it that there's only those two areas on the spectrum to fall?
Well, because those are also the only areas that we allow connection and discussion anyways. We were allowed to have bury your gays trope because, we allowed the gays to die. We've permitted you to have this narrative because it's special and only for you. But if you want to be equal like everyone else, then you only get the same narratives that everyone else gets, which is like rape and murder in horror films, saccharine love and like a Christmas romance film. Everyone's like just a silly little duffer in a comedy. It's like there is no nuance given to those types of things, and that's just really what we're all crying out for. I mean, genuine recommendation here. Fire Island was a fantastic film. Joaquin Booster, wonderful stuff. Gonna recommend that everyone go check it out. It is not only queer led, it is POC led. Margaret Cho is in it, goddammit. And you know what? It's not a bury your gays trope. It actually felt like a somewhat genuine reflection of like, no, this is faggotry on like a queer holiday that I'm like, no, I know these kids. I know these cunts. I know every single one of them. And I feel myself represented across them. And I also see my friends when I watch this. And I appreciate that.
Yes, I agree with that. I would second that recommendation. It is also, if you're a bit of a book nerd like I am, Fire Island is just a gay adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, kids. So
I thought so.
it's
I was like, this story sounds so familiar when I was watching it.
it's
I'm like, I think I've seen this before.
it is a lot of fun. And to kind of answer your point, Tim, and really I think that speaks to representation in general within the queer community, is that, for the longest time, we had two types of gay characters. We had, well, three. We had dying of AIDS, we had murder victim, or we had Jack from Will and Grace.
Mm.
And Jack from Will and Grace, for you older kids in the audience, is basically just the updated version of the Billy Crystal character from the 70s sitcom Soap.
Yeah.
So, and that's all we had. And the truth behind that is that I think television writing in general does not allow for the kind of subtlety that we would ultimately like to see. One of the reasons that I enjoy comics so much is that the long form storytelling in the hands of an adept writer gives you the opportunity to have more subtle characterizations, and characters can make bad decisions and still not be a terrible person, or they can be absolutely just flippant silly little boys or girls, and that doesn't destroy the characterization, and they're allowed to be more than that. My friends and I are all frequently very silly. We will also cry in movies. I mean, people contain all kinds of layers, and both the time constraints and just the general nature of television writing don't often allow for that.
Yeah. No, I agree. Quick recommendation here. I've not read the book yet, but I'm very, very excited to read it. It's Iron Widow by Jiangrey Zhao, non-binary Chinese American, I believe, or Chinese Canadian author. Also hilarious on YouTube. Please go and check them out. Now, to circle around to gaining a little bit here, I want to ask you, what is your experience like being non-binary within the gaming space? Do you feel like there was a sense of when you joined that you were you joined and were out about being non-binary? Did you come out after having joined? What has the community reception been like to your NB status?
Sure. Well, I've had a couple of different experiences in that regards. I say a lot of times that like I never really came out because I don't feel like I was ever in, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Even before I was old enough to understand the terminology, and really, I mean, again, I'm a little bit older. There wasn't a terminology. The term non-binary didn't really come to use even in academic circles until like the early 2000s, and it's only really receiving popular use in the last few years. And it is one of many labels that I know I have friends who identify themselves as genderqueer. It's a similar experience. That's not a word that I particularly like, although I do quite like the word queer. I like the slur reclamation aspect of the word queer. You might remember the old Simpsons episode of Homer going, that's our word for making fun of you. Yes, and now you don't get to use it anymore.
Which was so weird for me when I heard people start to refer to us as the queer community. Because I don't know, I guess I was living under a rock when we reclaimed it. Because I was like, isn't that what they used to call us to insult us?
I was about to say,
Yes.
you didn't get the minutes from the gay agenda.
I'm always out of the loop with that shit. Like, it's so funny whenever someone mentions the gay agenda. I'm like, do you know how many of us are just like living our own lives? Like, we don't give a flying fuck. There
Well,
is no agenda. No one's
You're
getting
not
together and planning
you're
anything.
you're not subbed to the homo schedule.
No.
well, it's just brunch, right? That's the gay agenda. It's just brunch, maybe
Yeah,
a
just
nap
brunch.
after.
Yeah.
Brunch. Unless you're
Um,
looking at the bitenary, then it might
Yeah.
involve axe throwing.
that's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will say too that queer for me rolls off the tongue a lot better than LGBTQIA2S.
Yeah, it does because that acronym is so
Sure.
fucking long now.
And I appreciate the intent of it. I like the idea of including as many people as possible. And frankly, that is why I like queer. That's also an aspect of why I like trans, because trans is very much an umbrella term that applies to, anyone not necessarily on the gender binary. And whether you choose to apply that label to yourself or not is, that's an entirely unique experience. I certainly know folks who go, "Oh, I'm very not trans." Okay, that's cool for you.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that. I know that kind of sounds condescending or flippant. I don't mean it that way, but use whatever terminology. I mean, language is fluid. I love when the pedantic language arguments come up in regard. Well, they is not a singular pronoun. Oh God, read a book. Literally, these are just silly arguments for people that don't want to bother to expand their vocabulary.
No, I
we're
agree. I wanted to ask, there's an element to which I said before, my mental health is the biggest influence on my gaining and looking after myself, and potentially there's an element of owning my sense of gender has allowed me a greater sense of, oh, I can move forward and gain weight and feel very confident in this. But in your experience, do you feel like shifts in your weight have led to different interpretations and feelings within your non-binary identity? As in, has your shift in weight shifted your gender identity or has potentially contributed to your current framing of gender identity?
I've thought about that quite a bit, and for me, I don't necessarily think that it has, but I think that is a more individual experience because I certainly know other non-binary gainers who, for them, it has. So I think that's kind of unique a little bit more to me. I don't generally frame my gender identity in relation to my size. They're very disconnected for me. So I know that I am happy with my body at a larger size. I have previously lost quite a bit of weight, largely due to some medical complications. And when that had happened, and I would just look in the mirror and just kind of be like, ugh, I don't like anything about this. I don't want to wear a large t-shirt. This does not feel good to me. But that was largely disconnected from the gender identity aspect to it. And if I could, I apologize. I realize I didn't really answer your question in regards to the community.
No,
since I am prone to tangents.
That's the whole point of these conversations, right? Like it's very Buddhist in a sense, like everything's connected. So even though you didn't necessarily ask the question in that type of way, like it still makes sense to me, I think. But as you were about to say, sorry, please continue.
Oh yeah, and I would say if you want behind the curtain, if you want to chop this up and move things around so they're a little more coherent, go for it, full permission. But I've had two very different experiences in regards to the community. The first one is my first gainer related event was the 2023 Grommr of the Seas, which was just a fantastic experience. But my partner had been on the one the year prior, and I, before we really booked, we kind of sat down and had a conversation like, am I going to feel weird? Is this, am I going to be the weird outlier on this cruise? I'm used to being the weird outlier. That's not necessarily the end of the world, but removed from kind of my home space and in an environment that I don't know with, okay, I only know one person here. Is this going to feel okay, or am I going to be miserable for a week? And my partner said, well, I know a lot of the people who are going, and I don't think you're going to feel weird. And then once we arrived, and I very quickly realized, like, oh, this group is like solidly 50% transgender, non-conforming, non-binary people. This is okay, fine. I'm not the only one. It's okay. We're good. And that was a really lovely experience overall. And just a shout out to everybody who was on that cruise, because I had an amazing time. It was my first cruise. It was my first gainer event. It was just a great experience all across the board. The other side of that is that on Grommr, which is the site that I am primarily on for gaining things. I mean, of course, I have Instagram and the TikToks and all the other things. But I'm most interactive with the community on Grommr, like I think a lot of folks are these days. It seems to be the biggest site. I'm very upfront about who and what I am. On most sites, it's in my username in some way, and it's very much in my profile. My pronouns are in my profile. I do pretty much immediately say, like, I am a trans non-binary person. This is who and what I am. This is who and what I'm looking for. And then when you get the random messages from folks you don't know, and sometimes even folks you do know, it's pretty quickly you can say, oh, you saw one picture and went, I think hot, must message. Because like you could I'll get a message that's like, you're a sexy man, and I'll respond like Janet from The Good Place, like, not a man. And then the response is just like, huh? Don't get me wrong. I appreciate the compliment. It's lovely that you think I'm sexy. However, calling me a man is not the way to get anywhere.
Can I also say, Janet from The Good Place is probably one of the most hilarious and perfect representations of just like belligerently non-binary, because obviously everything about them is female and feminine by the fact that they were just trying to create this character, but like there is this wonderful exploration of like the joke of not a man, not a woman, not a human, not a living, breathing creature. I am, in fact, actually a multi-tune machine of a 7th level intelligence that goes beyond the spectrum. And it's like, yes, this is wonderful. 7 of 9 has nothing on you.
Yes.
Tim, I'm curious to bring you in to this part of the conversation here, like, because we've had this conversation, like you were saying, there's an element of which now people, because you've aged into a bracket where people call you daddy, and people feel very comfortable calling you daddy, but like, how does that balance for you in terms of, again, gendered expectations, but also like implications of age? Like, it's a gendered expectation that brings in age.
It does, yeah. And you'd think that I would be insulted by that, but I think it's helped by the fact that I don't look like I'm 40. So it doesn't really bother me that much. Maybe if I were in my 60s, it'd be different. I don't know. But people have been calling me daddy since like I turned 35. And I leaned into it because I actually like that aesthetic. I like that idea. I like what daddy as a sexual term, as a like leatherman term, as a fetishistic term is supposed to represent. Because I did sort of the same thing when I threw myself into puppy years ago. And I actually kind of feel like daddy is sort of a natural transition as we get older, because I don't really feel like a pup anymore. I know some people remain pups their entire, fetish existence, but I've kind of transitioned out of puppy.
I think daddy is a really funny term, just in the sense of, and I certainly, as with you, because again, I'm a little older than Tim even, and I definitely get messages that are kind of immediately like, hey, daddy, and I'm like, you might want to read the profile. Also, that's a very familiar term, I think, to presume for someone. But also, if we look at mass media, there are, musicians and actors who are getting called daddy in the press. Like, that man is 27 years old. Like, he is not daddy. Give him a couple of decades, please.
Pedro Pascal has to be the youngest I would permit for daddy. I mean, look, not to be all that about the maths about it, but think about it like this. In order for a man to be a daddy, you ontologically have to be at least 18, old enough to consent to sex, and he himself must have been at least 18 when he had sex with your mother and your mother had you. So a daddy mathematically cannot be any younger than 36. If he's younger than 36, that man ain't a daddy. He can be your older brother, he can be your cousin, he can be your uncle, he can be whatever fucking incest fantasy you want to have going on, but he ain't daddy.
I don't know, if somebody called me uncle, that might actually freak me out.
Yes, well, it's a term that I think everybody has their own comfort level with. I
Mm.
mean, if you go through the list of other fetishes or other kinks on like Grommr profiles, there's like, uncle, cousin, father, son, doctor, patient, lawyer, client. Like we're getting very specific here, but okay. And I will admit, like on Grommr, I've changed my username a few times because I get bored and I have the ADHD. But I have at different times had dad in my profile. But I think some of that is like I have more than one person has told me like you're not the mom friend, but you're not quite the dad friend, but you look and sound like somebody's dad. I'm like, well, okay, that's fine.
That's what
Is it fucked up that when you said when you were listing off all those role plays and you said doctor patient, immediately what jumped into my head was no ethics violation, malpractice,
HIPAA violation,
HIPAA.
Look, we all got turned on by that scene in the Santa Claus. Okay, that's all I'm saying. Tim Allen is trash. Anyway,
yeah, he's a terrible person. Yeah, but it's a shame that he's such a terrible person
and not really a very good actor. I mean, the hotness of that scene is carried by the prosthetic gut. Let's be honest. Although the real talk, the beard doesn't hurt, in my opinion.
I will defend him in Galaxy Quest. He was brilliant in Galaxy Quest.
That's because that movie is the best Star Trek movie.
Yeah. That's right.
And I love
Star Trek.
And I love Star Trek. I'm a huge Trekkie. Galaxy Quest is the best Star Trek movie.
I do want to ask you, and this is also my personal curiosity, because someone asked me this question once. They're like, do you like being called boy? Do you like being called man? And I was a bit like, well, I'm a demi guy, so like male pronouns don't like turn me off in any way, shape, or form. Like I feel totally at peace with them. But I am curious because I've also had the opportunity to chat up some NB peeps who are gorgeous in my opinion, and I realize like I'm in the middle of horny texting and I'm right about to say dude or man or bro or daddy or something, and I'm just like and then I have to pause and think, hang on, what is the NB equivalent here? So for you, again, we're not presuming for other people, but at least just for you, like instead of calling you daddy or some variation of like male gendered, older, sexy person, what for you would be the preferred NB equivalent?
Well, I joke all the time that my preference is your grace or your highness. That is entirely a joke, though.
But if you're going to do that, if you're going to do that, your pronoun should be we.
That's also true. But then we sound like the Borg, or that's a whole different thing.
You have to get I'm sure that the pronoun we makes sense because you take up space enough for multiple people.
Also true. Well, and there's a great joke for those of us. I live in the North now, but I'm originally from the South. And there is a joke that y'all is gender neutral. So that's also a good one. No, it's an interesting topic because there are a lot of, and again, it is very much a spectrum. Like I know, demi folks and non-binary folks who are absolutely like, call me man, bro, dude, whatever. For me personally, dude makes my skin crawl. I want, when somebody calls me a dude, I want to die. It is the absolute, there is no faster way to end the horny talk.
God, how did you get through the 90s? That was like the number one word of the 90s.
Interesting. I think it's one of those things that as I have gotten older and more comfortable in my own identity, I feel like it bothers me more as it goes along. Like I'm not, man is a weird one because man is also kind of an exclamation, especially if you know a lot of people from California. Man as an exclamation doesn't personally bother me. Don't call me a man. Also, language is fluid, and again, like I'm very well aware of my presentation. I have my best friends slip and misgender. My partner will occasionally we'll be talking to their person and they'll go, oh, well, he said this. And even some of our other friends will be like, you mean they? He's like, yeah, oh, sorry, damn it. Yeah, it happens. It's fine. Look, I've misgendered myself before. It happens. It's okay. My rule of thumb is if I know that it's not malicious, like if I know you are my friend or you are my partner, I will never be offended by that. I will probably still correct you.
See, I think this is a very important conversation because I think this is another one of those sticking points that certain people try to use in conversation where it's like, oh, you can't make a mistake or it's all over. And it's like, no, like, just correct yourself and move on. Like, I would imagine it's the same thing with, like, again, looking at it through like a generic queer lens, right? Like someone, inappropriately uses and calls you a faggot, or like there's some kind of something that happens and they're like, oh shit, sorry. And like just acknowledge it and move forward. If you're, oh shit, oh no, oh god, I fucked up, I've ruined it all. Like that's what becomes weird, because it's like we were just talking and you derailed the conversation to basically indulge yourself in some weird kind of gender-based telenovela moment. But because you're fat, it's telenatella moment.
Sorry.
Sorry, triggering the ADD. It's like, oh, need some Nutella. Yeah.
Great, now I'm hungry. Thanks.
Well, you're fat. You need to eat.
This is true.
But I think it's a good touch point. For anyone listening who is worried about these things, like, first of all, just ask. Like, also, if anyone you talk to, you look at and go, like, it twigs in your brain, like, oh, they could be non-binary. I'm gonna ask them the question, like, oh, hey, can I just confirm, like, what pronouns do you use? And if they get all like, I'm a dude, I'm him, I'm he, and like they get weird about it, it's like, okay, it's actually not a big deal. It's also sort of like if someone looks at you and goes like, oh, I thought you might have been trans, right? That's not a bad thing, because there's nothing wrong with being trans. Right? So like if someone gets all in their feelings about oh, you assumed that I was non-binary, or you assumed that I was trans, like that's usually a good litmus test for people who probably have a little bit too many feelings and maybe a bit of sensitivity around their gender. Just putting that out there. Fat is also, just putting it out there, a great gender nullifier. Like the most wonderful part of both, let's say, men and women, if you want to put the binary into play like that, you put them both up to like 500 pounds, bitches' bodies look identical. Everybody got titty, everybody got huge ass, everybody got a vagina at that point, because everything's fucking married. You could have had a gigantic schlong. Bitch, you got a clit now, because you're fucking everything swallowed up by that shit. Like, everybody gender neutral at that size. So fat is also like a really wonderful equalizer, gender-wise, I think.
I think you're definitely right about that, and I will say that is a thing that I enjoy about fat people and fat bodies. And I'm a big fan of softness in general. Look, I want a partner whose belly I can use as a pillow. That washboard is not going to provide a good sleeping surface, honey.
I want to ask here, is there an aspect to the sort of intersection of non-binary and gaining that we haven't touched on yet that you want to bring to the fore?
I don't know that it's so much an aspect of gaining in regards to it, but more just a faction of like kind of awareness. But certainly in my experience, the place where I experience it the most is certainly like on Grommr or in gainer related, internet spaces. And that is, just like you don't necessarily want to make assumptions about people in regards to their gaining. You don't know what people's goals are. You don't know how happy they are or not with their body. Gaining and trans or non-binariness have a very common thread, which is body dysmorphia. There are lots of trans and non-binary people who are generally okay with their body. There are a lot of trans and non-binary people who are absolutely not. And gaining is definitely another facet to that. I know gainers who are 500 pounds and look at themselves in the mirror and go, still too skinny. And we see that in regular, non-gainer culture too. We see people who look in the mirror, and this is, I think, a stereotype perpetuated by TV and movies a lot too. But, we see someone who puts on 10 pounds and, they're Hollywood fat. But, there's a scene of them looking in the mirror, grabbing their belly, going, oh, I'm disgusting. It's like, you are an ounce overweight. Calm down. Yeah.
It's a lot of those things. And I don't know. Oh, by the way, sorry, this just crossed my mind. There was the study done by Tony Munger exploring different facets of the gainer experience based on the surveys that people filled out and submitted. I want to bring up something that he says in one of the introductory paragraphs, which is, of course, it was a survey done specifically about gainers. It's not that it was closed off to women, but obviously it was marketed to and specifically for gainers, which comprise primarily of gay men. But he mentions in his introduction a surprisingly large contingent of trans and non-binary individuals. And briefly chatting back and forth with him about it, he was like, yeah, no, it was noticeable. Like, not a small amount. So I think there is something to be said about the way in which gender does maybe play out a little bit differently in the gainer community. And I know that this has a lot of expectation, the ex-jock fantasy, or Tim, like you were saying about masculinity. And I do agree that like aspects of size allow me to feel more in alignment with my sense of maleness. But again, I think that's just my relation to the node of maleness, which is somewhere off in the distance. It's not over the event horizon by any stretch of the imagination, but she is over there, and we wave to each other every now and again, and it's, hello, you doing right over there? Yeah, good, mate, you're right. Oh, and mate, Australian mate, wonderful gender neutral term. Everyone is mate.
Mate's a good one. Well, in relation to that, it's the body dysmorphia. When you are a gainer, you are already modifying your body in a way that is deemed largely unacceptable by society. And that is definitely, there is correlation there to the trans experience if you are a person who chooses to transition. But, a lot of non-binary folks that I know, in my experience, and including myself, there may be a social transition, but not necessarily a medical one. Or there may be, their degree, again, it's a spectrum like anything else. I've known gainers who take estrogen to help them with getting fatter.
Yeah, to explore more cities, bitch, because they want them luscious tatas.
I don't think that's the most common experience, certainly, but not all trans people take, hormone replacement therapy. So, it just depends on your own level of comfort in your own body. And the truth of it is, when you are a non-binary person, in society, much like being a gainer, these are not generally things that are terribly secretive. Your people are going to know that you are fat. People are going, depending on what you're wearing and your grooming, of course, but people won't necessarily know that you're non-binary, but there's a decent chance they will. I've literally been asked in public if I'm a man or a woman. Yeah. And my response is usually, God, I hope not.
Oh fuck. Very well. But I think what we can take away from this conversation, at least on my end, and I want to get both of y'all's take on this shortly. What I take away from this is that gender plays a role that it's funny. There's this hyperfixation on it about the purpose and the meaning, and yet that is, in my experience, not at all what gender does. And I think understanding gender can have a wonderful effect on someone's life, but a lot of that comes with this knowledge of respect and how we end up treating other people. And I feel like the takeaway from today is we can learn a lot about gaining and a lot about non-binary by just kind of observing the other and just listening to people's stories. And so really right here, I want to say thank you for sharing your stories and experiences with us today. But just as a way of closing off, I want to ask you both again, like what you've kind of taken away from today, but also, Jean, to ask you, for anyone listening who is maybe considering exploring a non-binary identity for a spell, what would you say to them?
My first thing is go for it. If you're interested, if you feel like that resonates with you, why not? This is the thing. Until we get into the very intense medical transitioning, there's very little you can do to your body that's permanent. Even some of the biggest gainers have reversed course at some point. I don't recommend that, but that's just me. But wearing a different style of clothing, dyeing your hair an unusual color, shaving or growing facial hair, any of these things that you want to do to your body are things that can very easily be undone. Experiment and see how you feel most comfortable, and that's ultimately all that matters. I generally think that RuPaul is largely kind of a trash person, but the quote of, what other people think of me is none of my business, is honestly kind of a great mantra to live by. It doesn't ultimately matter. Are you happy with who you are and the way that you present yourself? And here's the thing, that can even change day by day. There are certainly days where I go out in a flat cap and a, I live where it's cold now. So, a flannel shirt and some, heavy pants and boots and, until I open my mouth, then it's, oh, she's a faggot. But, until I open my mouth, you don't necessarily know, I have a thick nose ring. These are not traits that are traditionally feminine, but at the same time, if I am going to, last year when we went to the Florence and the Machine show and I wore, quote unquote women's pants and a black blouse and a long black cardigan sweater and, was living my best American Horror Story coven fantasy. And, but you would look at somebody in that position, you go, okay, that's probably a non-binary person, and that can change day to day. And, even cisgendered gay men, I know plenty of gay men who will go, wow, I'm feeling butch today. Like today I am daddy. And, these things are all fluid. Explore, have fun. It doesn't hurt anyone. If you painted your nails one day, not that that's an indicator either. I mean, no individual traits, but, if you've never painted your nails, you go, I'd like to experiment with that. I know a lot of cisgendered, big, beefy bear dudes that get pedicures and paint their nails pink or purple or whatever. That doesn't say anything about you as a person. It doesn't threaten anything. Feel free to explore, do some reading. We mentioned, Alok's book, Beyond the Gender Binary is one of the best, I think, resources. Utilize the internet. There are a lot of celebrities out there that make fantastic TikTok videos and Instagram posts. We've mentioned Jonathan Van Ness. Alok is a great one. Jeffrey Marsh is a fantastic one. Yasmin Finney is, great.
Miss Darren comes to mind for me. Ellie Darren.
Ellie Darren, yes, that's a great one. There are people, just know that, whatever you feel comfortable as is the person that you are meant to be. None of us were put here to be miserable, to doubt ourselves, to question ourselves, to live in a way that doesn't feel authentic to us. And it does not matter what anyone else thinks about that. And that's not to say that there won't be challenges potentially, if you have a close relationship with like biological family, they're going to have ideas, they're going to have notions, but know that your gender identity and presentation doesn't have anything to do, their reaction doesn't have anything to do with you. That is about them being forced to face things that they have hang-ups about, and that is their problem.
Love that. Tim, baby, what about you? Closing thoughts?
Before I answer that, I do want to, because Gene had said things about like, big bears getting their fingernails painted and everything. Where was that when I was in high school and a goth and I was wearing eyeliner and black nail polish and black lipstick? Like, and the only question that I ever got asked was, why? Why do you do that? Why? And like, even though at this point in my life, I'm kind of like, I don't think I'm going to be experimenting with that anymore. Like, I'm pretty settled into where I feel I am. Like, that was the closest I ever got to it. But man, when I reflect on my high school years, I'm like, if someone had just come up to me and said, oh, I think I like that, or that's cool, or I like the fact that your hair is bright blue, but all I ever got was, why? Why are you doing that? Why?
Oh, honey, I feel that. I spent a good 2 decades looking like a member of The Cure. Yeah, so, yes. But the funny thing about that is I think that having goth friends as a teenager actually did ease the non-binary aspects of being an adult, because really, like, someone who called themselves a man wearing makeup, having giant teased hair and pink hair and whatever, none of that was that weird in my friend group. If you showed up to school with black nails, it wasn't, what are you doing? It was, ooh, what color black is that? Is that new? What shade is that? So yeah. Yeah,
I had blue hair for a very short period. I had bright blue, like electric blue hair, and I'll never forget that one of my friend's parents like tried to sit me down and have this very condescending heart-to-heart talk about how I shouldn't be doing that because it's not normal and it doesn't fit. And I was just like, who the fuck are you? You're not even my parent and you're trying to do this. Like, shut the fuck up.
Honey, normal is just a setting on a washing machine.
And it also makes me think, just quickly as we begin to wrap up, Kiss.
Oh yeah.
Baby,
full face of makeup, yeah.
The epitome of metal and masculine music for a time. You know what I mean? Like Ziggy Stardust. I just I don't know.
The fact that members of Kiss and Twisted Sister and other similar musicians of that age group, one, boomer audience, people who grew up on David Bowie, are now transphobic. And the fact that the band members in this band are kind of low-key transphobic is wild to me. Like, you did this yourself. What are you talking about? But, you know, of course, part of the thing with Kiss was like, oh, we have a full face of makeup, but we'll still fuck a babe. Good for you, honey.
Yeah. That still feels like part of the experience, but hey, you know, denial is a thing, and this has been a wonderful opportunity to get to know more about you, to explore more about this gendered experience within gaming, but also life and all those things. So, Jean, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing everything.
You are very welcome. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Oh, wonderful. Now, listen, where can people find you online?
Well, if you're on Grommr, my username is uncannyphoenix because I have a brand. And if you're on Instagram, you can find me at mx or mxjeangrey, which is just my name. That's pretty much the only two places. I do have a Facebook, but I do keep that pretty locked down. That's generally reserved for just people I actually know. But yeah, if you have questions or comments or whatever, I'm certainly open to hearing them. If you do message me on Instagram, please send me some sort of message so that I know that you're not just a spam bot, because that's generally all that follows me on Instagram. But feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk to folks.
No worries. Well, listen, that's a wrap for now here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. If you like this episode, the podcast, or just us in general, share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and BlueSky at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at ThiccyMouse. You can also look us up on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Thicc Radio, or at our website at podpage.com/Thicc Radio. If you want to submit a voice note or become a financial supporter of the show, you can find the links in the show notes, and you can also write to us at thethicradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Enter app podcast produced by Stannnum and Thiccy Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by Lokitu.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify.